The Meek Shall Inherit the Earth, a 5-part series by L.S. Larkey and Atlantean Astrology. Part 1, the context of the Beatitudes and Jesus' radical message. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where the Beatitudes are found, stands as one of the most profound and radical teachings in human history, delivered to a diverse audience of the downtrodden, the oppressed, and the marginalized in first-century ancient Israel. The sermon presents a worldview that defies both Roman imperial power and the rigid Jewish religious hierarchy. Among the Beatitudes, Jesus declared, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." While this statement has often been interpreted as an elevation of meekness as a moral and spiritual virtue, it is essential to delve deeper into the historical and social context to understand its full significance. Far from being a simple message of spiritual comfort, this declaration, when seen through the lens of its context, carries a more complex and potentially subversive meaning. The meek in Jesus' time were not merely humble and patient individuals, rather, they were people living under extreme social, political, and religious pressures. People whose passivity, submission, and lack of resistance had been molded by the oppressive forces of empire and religious law. This section will explore how the political landscape of Roman-occupied ancient Israel shaped the conditions of meekness, and how Jesus' message, rather than praising this condition, challenged it. The socio-political climate of Roman Israel. First-century ancient Israel was a land occupied by the vast and formidable Roman Empire. The Jewish people living under Roman rule experienced a complex and often brutal system of control that governed nearly every aspect of their lives. The Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace, was maintained through military force, economic exploitation, and psychological manipulation. The Roman authorities enforced their power with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that any resistance was crushed swiftly. Crucifixion, a method of execution reserved for rebels and criminals, served as a constant and public reminder of the cost of defying Roman rule. In this environment, the Jewish people were subjugated to severe economic and political pressures. Taxation was heavy, with Jewish farmers and laborers often finding themselves in debt to Roman authorities or wealthy landowners. The Roman elites, alongside a small number of Jewish collaborators, enriched themselves at the expense of the common people. This created a social structure in which the majority of the population was pushed to the brink of survival, struggling to make ends meet while simultaneously facing cultural and religious pressures. The religious establishment, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees, was also complicit in this system of control. While the Pharisees sought to maintain Jewish religious identity through strict adherence to the Torah and the oral traditions, their focus on legalism often alienated the common people, who could not live up to the burdensome requirements of the law. The Sadducees, who controlled the temple in Jerusalem, had a more direct alliance with Roman authorities, benefiting from the status quo that kept the masses under control. Together, the Roman occupiers and the religious elites created a system that kept the Jewish people politically oppressed, economically marginalized, and spiritually burdened. The taming of the population. In such a system, meekness was not merely a personal virtue, but a socially engineered condition. The Jewish population, having faced centuries of foreign domination, first by the Babylonians, then by the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans, had become accustomed to living under the thumb of external powers. While there were groups such as the Zealots who advocated for violent resistance against Roman rule, the majority of the population had been tamed into submission, resigned to their oppressed state. The Roman authorities, along with the religious elites, encouraged this passivity by promoting ideas of patience, endurance, and submission as spiritual virtues. The Latin word for meek, mansuetus, reflects this reality. Derived from the words manus, hand, and suetus, accustomed, it originally referred to domesticated animals, creatures that had been tamed and rendered docile by human control. Over time, this word came to describe people who had been similarly subdued, who had learned to accept their place in the world without resistance. In this sense, meekness was not a natural virtue, but a condition imposed by the forces of power. The meek of first-century ancient Israel were those who had been tamed by the twin forces of Roman imperialism and Jewish religious legalism. They were the people who had been forced into submission by the overwhelming might of the empire and the rigid structures of religious law. They did not resist their oppressors, for they had been taught that resistance was futile. They did not seek to challenge the status quo, for they had been conditioned to believe that their suffering was part of God's plan and that their reward would come in the afterlife, not in this life. Meekness as a social tool. The promotion of meekness as a virtue was not an accidental byproduct of Roman rule, it was a deliberate tool of social control. Throughout history, empires have used religious and moral teachings to keep their populations in check, and Rome was no different. The Roman Empire allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religious practices, but only so long as those practices did not interfere with the empire's control. In the case of the Jewish people, this meant that religious leaders were often co-opted into the imperial system, using their influence to promote submission and passivity among the population. The religious elites, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees, played a key role in this process. By emphasizing the importance of following the law, they encouraged the Jewish people to focus on their spiritual obligations rather than their political and social oppression. They taught that meekness, submission to God's will, was a path to righteousness, and that those who suffered in this life would be rewarded in the next. This message was not without merit, but it also served the interests of those in power. By promoting meekness as a virtue, the religious authorities helped to ensure that the Jewish population would remain passive and compliant, accepting their suffering without question. The Romans, too, benefited from this promotion of meekness. As long as the Jewish people believed that their suffering was divinely ordained and that their reward would come in the afterlife, they were less likely to resist Roman rule. The empire's brutal methods of control, taxation, crucifixion, military presence, were effective in maintaining order, but they were complemented by the more subtle methods of religious manipulation. By allowing the religious elites to promote meekness as a virtue, the Romans ensured that the population would remain tamed, docile, and easy to govern. Jesus' radical challenge to meekness. In this context, Jesus' statement that the meek shall inherit the earth takes on a radically different meaning. Rather than praising meekness as a spiritual virtue, Jesus may have been critiquing the condition of submission that had been imposed on the people. The meek, those who had been tamed by the forces of empire and religion, would inherit the earth, but not the kingdom of heaven. They would continue to live in the world of material possessions, political oppression, and religious legalism, but they would not experience the spiritual liberation that Jesus was offering. Jesus' message was not one of passivity or submission. It was a call to spiritual and intellectual awakening. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently challenged the systems of power that kept people in bondage, whether those systems were political, economic, or religious. He preached a message of radical love, forgiveness, and liberation, one that defied the norms of both Roman and Jewish society. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, he was speaking of a reality that transcended the earthly systems of power. The kingdom of heaven was not a place where the meek, in their current state of submission, would be rewarded. Rather, it was a realm for those who had awakened to the truth, those who had embraced the spiritual transformation that Jesus was offering. The meek, by remaining in their state of submission and passivity, were choosing to remain in the darkness of ignorance. They were choosing to follow the rules of the land, rather than seeking the deeper spiritual truths that Jesus was revealing. Jesus' call for spiritual awakening. Jesus' radical message, therefore, was not a call to meekness in the traditional sense, but a call to break free from the chains of submission and ignorance. The meek, those who were weak-minded and easily manipulated, were not the ones who would inherit the kingdom of heaven. That inheritance was reserved for those who had the courage to question the systems of power, who sought spiritual truth over worldly conformity. In calling the meek blessed, Jesus may have been issuing a challenge that the meek would inherit the earth, the material world of suffering and oppression, if they chose to remain in their current state. But for those who chose to awaken, to break free from the tamed condition that had been imposed on them, the kingdom of heaven awaited. It was not a kingdom of submission, but of spiritual liberation, a realm where truth, love, and justice reigned, free from the corrupting influences of earthly power.